Hello and welcome. I'm Fred Cate. I'm Vice President for Research, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second in our series looking at the Indiana University Grand Challenges and the impact they're making, not just across the university, but across the state and the nation as well. As you undoubtedly know, the Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge was begun. It was in 2017, our second Grand Challenge, and designed to really take on the massive subject of the effects of climate change and how Indiana can help prepare for those, how we can mitigate the impact, how we can use science and policy and education to really change the way in which the state deals with these critical issues. We observed, as you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to, that the state's getting hotter, that springs are getting wetter, that we're seeing more flooding, and that we're seeing dramatically different patterns of diseases. The sort of theme for the today really being these invasive species that we're seeing, including bringing Lyme disease and Zika and Westphal-Virus and others. And so the Environmental Change Initiative was set up, and at the core of that was this Environmental Resilience Institute, which really helps to bring together researchers across the university and also helps to serve as the real hub for interdisciplinary research among those researchers and between those researchers and many of our external partners. Those partners include, by the way, Cummins and Citizens Energy Group, Duke Energy, the Nature Conservancy, and many government officials, including many local governments in Bloomington, Carmel, Indianapolis, New Albany, and elsewhere. And we're very proud of this as a way of addressing the challenges that all of the grand challenges are addressing, working not just across the interdisciplinary breadth of the university, but with partners outside as well. I want to say just a quick word that Environmental Change Grand Challenge was started with Ellen Ketterson as the PI, and really only somebody like distinguished Professor Ellen Ketterson could have gotten this going, and we are deeply grateful to her. She was succeeded in the role of the principal investigator and the director of the Environmental Resilience Institute by Janet McCabe. And Janet, as you undoubtedly know, unless you have been living under a rock recently, has been named the Deputy Administrator of the EPA. And I know we all want to join in congratulating Janet on this extraordinary accomplishment and this great news for our nation. Now, we are joined today by some exceptional researchers. There were many to choose from. Let me say, the Environmental Resilience Institute brings together more than 100 researchers, but we're joined by 4 today who are going to focus in particular on some of the critical issues, looking at how environmental change is leading to changes in plants and animals and disease patterns with implications for the natural and human worlds. So I'm going to introduce them very quickly, and then I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves and their research in greater detail. First, Anna Bento is assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the IU School of Public Health in Bloomington, and adjunct professor in evolution, ecology, and behavioral and the behavior program in the Department of Biology. And Anna was, as will be the case with all but one of our colleagues today, was a Grand Challenge sponsored hire. So we're delighted to welcome you. And then we're joined by Jennifer Lau, is an associate professor in biology at the again IU Bloomington College of Arts and Sciences. She works with the ecology, evolutionary ecology, to study how human caused global changes influence plants and insects and microbes and the like. And she too, if I'm not mistaken, is a Grand Challenge sponsored hire. And so we are, again, delighted, the really tangible evidence of what the Grand Challenge is doing in the university and in the state. We're joined by Ranjan Muthukrishnan, who is a community ecologist, and he's an ERI fellow, an ecologist fellow, one of the dozen fellows who the ERI has brought in to both do their own work and to engage in research with other partners across Indiana and Indiana University. And again, you came, I believe, in 2018, and we're really delighted to have you. And I hope you're going to tell a little bit more of the story about your own engagement with ERI. And then finally, Richard Hardy is a professor of biology at the College of Arts and Sciences, has research interest in the reaction of mosquito-transmitted viruses in the insect hosts. And He collaborates along with our colleague, as also part of ERI, Irene Newton, but who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, to examine the molecular mechanisms that underlie the pathogen blocking effects of things which I can't even pronounce, but I know you will explain in great detail. So what I'd like to do is, if you don't mind, I know it shows a certain lack of creativity if we just went alphabetically to start. So start with Anna and just take a few moments to say something about your research and about the type of impact it either is having or you hope it's going to have on helping Hoosiers prepare for the environmental change that we see all around us.
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself so we don't hear the usual, we cannot hear you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Fred. It was very nice. So I'm a mathematical ecologist that focuses on infectious diseases. And I tend to focus, as Fred said, on the ecological and evolutionary impacts of anthropogenic drivers. And these actually range from climate change to vaccination, if you believe it, that you can actually consider vaccination as an anthropogenic driver. So I look at those effects on diseases in both humans and animals, and I'm very interested in things like demographic heterogeneity and the structure of populations of both the hosts and the parasites, whatever they might be. I tend to take a holistic approach to extract information where I integrate experimental work, observational data, and then ultimately ecological theory. And then I tend to put them all up in a mathematical model to try and infer some information from all of these data. So one of the work that I've been doing in terms of how to prepare Hoosiers in this context of climate change is in collaboration with some colleagues at the School of Public Health in the biology department and also at Tulane University, looking at the expansion of ticks in the Midwest due to climate change. So this idea that we are now seeing both ticks and the parasites that they host expanding from the East Coast all the way through the Midwest. And this tends to be for longer springs, warmer summers, and an overwinter that is a lot less aggressive for these hosts. So we are trying to develop early warning signals. So this is where I come in. We develop these mathematical models that look at the experimental data, the observational data, and the time series of occurrence of these ticks. And then my colleagues will do all the hard work in terms of collecting the data to try and understand what those numbers reflect in terms of probabilities of infection to humans. So the fun thing about this work, if I can call it fun, is that we're working at this cool interface between wildlife and humans. So we're not just interested in what happens with the humans, but also try to understand what we are doing in terms of encroaching onto the habitats of this wildlife that at times actually does live in equilibrium with both the ticks and the parasites that they host. So I'm going to leave it at that and then hold on to questions because I'm assuming that there might be some questions on COVID as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Jen, we'll go to you next.
Hey, thanks. So like Fred mentioned, I'm a community ecologist and evolutionary ecologist who studies how plants and the microbes and insects that they interact with respond to human-caused environmental changes. And I think we can probably all agree that there's no doubt that humans have huge impacts on the environment. CO2 concentrations are rising, temperatures are increasing, species are invading from areas, across the globe. And a big question is, what are the effects of all these global changes on natural populations? And in my case, I focus on the plants. So how are plants responding to these global changes? Will they go extinct or will they survive and thrive? And what determines which they will be? Will they be one of the winners that increase in abundance or one of the losers that declines to extinction? So my research addresses this topic in a few different ways. Some of my studies investigate things like how invasive species, the species from other areas of the globe, versus native species respond to these changes and why they might respond differently. Other parts of my work focus on all the cool organisms that plants interact with, like the diverse microbial communities that inhabit every inch of soil. And how do those microbes change in ways that might help plants or hurt plants in how they respond to some of these global changes that we face today. And I address these questions in natural populations, so wild populations, but also in agricultural systems.
So can I, just before even we go further, just ask a quick follow-up question? So if Anna's building mathematical models, what's your methodology for doing this? What's your milieu you're working in here, if you will?
Yeah, big field experiments.
Right.
So long-term experiments that simulate human-caused environmental changes, whether it's global warming or simulating biological invasions, and investigating how species respond.
Great, thank you very much, and we'll be right back to you. Okay, Ranjan, let's go to you next.
Hi, I'm Ranjan. It's actually really nice to chat with all of you and to go right after Jen, because I think in many ways my interests are a nice complement to what she does, both in approaches and some questions. I'm also a community ecologist, and I think a lot about invasive species. And sort of the way I would frame it is, you know, when we think about, and I've been interested in global change, environmental change for a long time, and certainly when you think about that, top of mind is climate change and warming and all those sorts of things. And it is absolutely an existential crisis. But if you think about something like biodiversity, which I'm really interested in, depending on how you slice it, while climate change is important on the long term, it may not actually be the most important proximate effect on biodiversity over maybe the next 20 years. And in that context, I've thought a lot about invasive species. And while Jen was talking about doing large-scale field experiments, I've done a little bit of the complement of sort of working in natural systems and sort of observing the dynamics of invasions happening, you know, in these sort of natural experiments we have when invasions happen. And so what I've been really interested in at the ERI is actually thinking about how climate change and invasions might be interacting with each other, and how climate change might be making those invasions worse, or are there scenarios where they may actually be less bad because of something to do with climate change. And so a big experiment that I've been running, or big study I've been running since being at the ERI, is actually to look at this invasive, you know, we use as an example, an invasive algae in lakes. And we look at it in a large gradient from Indiana to Wisconsin to Minnesota and across multiple years. And we can use both, you know, different weather in different years and this latitudinal gradient as proxies for what the world might look like under climate change. You know, the South tends to be what the North might look like in 50 years. And, you know, we have warmer years and cooler years. And by integrating both of those components, we can start predicting how these invasions might react under these warmer conditions or changed conditions for the future. And the other thing that I will point out is, so I'm a community ecologist and a field ecologist, and I do these sort of large scale studies in the field, but I collaborate strongly with a number of social scientists who are thinking about the way people perceive invasions, they perceive these resources that they care about, like lakes, and how they make decisions to manage those, as well as how those decisions might change under climate change. Because while in many ways this is a natural phenomenon that we have to worry about, it is social processes, social endeavors, social decision-making that's going to be in many ways the biggest component of how we respond to environmental change.
Great, thank you very much. So Rich, and just so that other people don't think I'm crazy, when I say alphabetical, it's by first name. So you're not used to being at the end when we do things alphabetically, but in any event, in this case you are. So the floor is yours.
Thanks. So yeah, my research is generally focused on the molecular biology of virus replication, and we're interested in mosquito-transmitted viruses. Irene Newton, who is also a professor in the biology department, is interested in a bacterial endosymbiont. So this is a bacterium that infects and lives inside the cells of 40 to 60% of the insects on Earth, and it's Wolbachia pipientis. I think that was what you were looking for earlier.
Thank you very much. You make it sound amazing.
It's and one of the effects of insect colonization with Wolbachia is that it reduces the replication of a particular group of viruses. And those viruses include many viruses that are transmitted by mosquitoes to humans and are of public health consequence. So things like dengue virus, yellow fever, Zika, and one that we've got to start being a little bit more concerned about, maybe around here, northern Indiana, maybe, is Eastern equine encephalitis virus.
Wow.
And so Irene and I do a lot of molecular biology looking at the mechanisms of how Wolbachia impacts the cells of the insects and prevents the viruses from being able to replicate. But with the ERI work, we're interested in how natural populations of mosquitoes, how prevalent Wolbachia is in natural populations of mosquitoes, and how that relates to the ability of those different mosquito species to be able to host virus and then potentially transmit virus. The simple prediction would be that if you have Wolbachia around, then your vectorial capacity for that particular mosquito population is going to be decreased, which reduces human risk. So we're interested in, what we're doing is we're sampling, we're doing a lot of field sampling of mosquito populations in southern Indiana, and looking at how those change, the distribution of different species, the prevalence of different species change over time at specific geographic locations, how that relates to both temperature and rainfall over the time period, and then whether Wolbachia is present in those species, and then ultimately whether virus is present in those mosquitoes as well, to try and combine those different measurements to give us an idea of what risk might look like and vectorial capacity of mosquito populations in southern Indiana might be. Probably West Nile is the one that we would be maybe most concerned around in southern Indiana. Yeah, so this is the first time I've ever ventured into anything resembling field work, so I'm really enjoying it. It's very different for me.
Great, thank you very much. And so lots of questions. And let me say, by the way, for everyone participating today, you can ask questions. The easiest way to do that is just type them into the Q&A, and we will get to those just a little bit later as we keep talking. Jonathan Hines, who plays a key role in ERI and is the organizer for today, will pull those together and throw them out to us so that you can hopefully answer them. But I will, in the meantime, go ahead and pursue some of my own questions. I'm particularly interested in the kind of goal of the type of work that you all are doing. And I understand it may be very different, but you know, we're all living with COVID now, and the goal with COVID seems to be, you know, eradicate it or control it or vaccinate everybody so they're not susceptible to it. So what is the goal in the type of amazing research that you are describing? Is it just to observe the phenomenon? Is it to make predictions? Is it to change the course in which we might otherwise see something unfold, or to alert policymakers and industry? Again, anyone can jump in. I don't know, Anna, you raised this first, but if anyone who wishes to jump in.
So in my project, so I have different systems that I work with, and those, as I mentioned very briefly, range from tick-borne diseases to the impact of climate change on population dynamics of vegetation, which Jen and I need to talk about, and also which is merely observational, that one. And also now, of course, COVID-19, which of course we all jumped with the call of duty in terms of helping as much as we could, and then ranging from my first love, which is childhood vaccine preventable diseases such as measles, pertussis, and mumps. So the kind of work that I tend to do has a eco-evolutionary component that addresses I need to understand the mechanisms. And they tend to be, if I may say, perversely cool, right? Because we want to understand what are the drivers that leads a disease to become a problem in a population, but it's not in another one. So these range from demographic stochasticity to environmental stochasticity to evolutionary components of the pathogen. So there's that kind of like voyeur component of my work where I just want to see what's happened in the past and in the present. And then it comes the practical one. Because I deal in infectious diseases, a lot of my work tends to then have that application for public health, as such that as long as I understand the mechanisms, I can at least make predictions and create a set of advisory points that might be helpful for control in populations that I'm studying. So yes, so a little bit of A and a little bit of B, depending on which hat I'm using in what day.
Okay, others?
I'm happy to comment on this a little. So I tend to think of myself as, or the long-term deep goal of the work is to help people make better decisions in a certain sense. You know, in a lot of ways as scientists, we think of just, you know, oh, there's an answer out there, we just go and find it. But if scientists are going to be helpful to the world and help the world make better decisions about how to do something like manage resources, I think that they need some of that scientific advice. Like, I don't necessarily assume that as the scientist, I have the right opinions about what is the correct way to manage your system. But I think that if people don't understand what's going on in their systems, it'll be very difficult for them to make thoughtful, effective decisions. Because they're either not going to know what the effect of those decisions are or what sort of consequences of making or not making decisions. And so I think of doing the sort of ecological science to understand the ecological dynamics that you need to predict outcomes, but then again, to figure out how to work with social scientists and communities to really understand how that science needs to be contextualized or made relevant to the actual questions people have. And in the end, it's those communities that have to make the decisions about what matters to them, how they weigh things, like what trade-offs they're willing to make. And I can help inform those decisions with some science. But I really see myself as aiding those communities in that decision-making process.
Okay, thank you. Jen, I don't know if you or Rich want to jump in. You don't have to, but I certainly want you to have the chance.
I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, I think for me, you know, environmental challenges are really tricky because scientists like me can document that there's a problem and, you know, even identify, you know, why there's a problem and maybe even how to fix it. But just like Ranjan was saying, like to actually change something or requires that people buy in, and people buy in that there is a problem and that it is fixable. And, you know, it's just putting the effort there. And yeah, and so like these collaborations with social scientists, you know, that help people like me, you know, a basic research scientist, figure out what work should I be doing and what work do people care about and what work are they willing to embrace, you know, to make things better is, yeah, it's tricky.
So if I can just follow on that point for 1 second. So one of the things that we really thought about with this grand challenge was the importance of collaboration or partnership, as I keep using the word. And that, look, anytime you spend money and you hire great people and you fund great research, you're going to get something good out of it. Anyone could do that. But that one of the reasons why it made sense for a university like IU to be doing this was that the breadth of the university actually offered an advantage here, and the working relationships with so many partners outside of the university added an advantage. And I think, Jen, you just touched on this in terms of working with social scientists. Does this bear out? I mean, in other words, you could make the opposite argument. You could say, look, better to have teams of scientists working in isolation to get their work done and not be troubled by all of this other stuff around them. As the partnership approach, is it making a difference? And Jen, I know you have a story to hear because you got at least one partnership out of it. But I'm curious as to whether this approach, the sort of ERI approach, as opposed to just looking at individual key scientific inquiry, is making a difference.
Can I jump in here first? So yeah, I mean, I think it totally is. So I mean, I'm a basic researcher. I'm an ecologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I started studying environmental problems because they're fantastic, natural, big experiments. You know, you poke at a system and see what happens. But since coming to the ERI, you know, for the first time in my career, I had a historian come to my lab and talk about science, and that doesn't just happen, right? You know, it takes something like the Environmental Resilience Institute to bring those people together. And then, you know, my most recent project involves a social science collaborator, and it's some of the most fun work I've done in years. We're talking about the coevolution of human and microbial systems. And it doesn't happen everywhere, right? I mean, I've been around a long time, and this is the first time, and it's really exciting. I know Ranjan has other stories too.
Great, thank you, Ranjan.
Yeah, well, I will say, being at the ERI, these ideas of collaborations and partnerships are hands down the thing that is the most important, most valuable, and not least because I fell in love and met my partner. But you know, again, when I was talking about sort of offering science that's relevant to people, I would say my PhD and even the very beginning of my postdoc, I was a very, much like Jen was talking about, basic scientist. It was very quantitative, very basic, almost theoretical work. And that's fun. I think it's really interesting. But I think I moved towards thinking about invasive species because it was interesting in its ethical and social dimensions. And that's what drew me to those questions, but I still dealt with them in a pretty straightforward, scientific, quantitative modeling way. And it was really only when I joined the ERI that I was able to work with other people who actually work with people rather than just in these natural systems, that my work was able to move beyond sort of this pure theoretical science, just write papers for the scientific literature, to actually, how do we make that science relevant and applicable into the decisions people are really working with, and that idea of, or that opportunity to work with with social science collaborators is not something I'd really had much opportunity to do. And the ERI, you know, I really think that I was one of the strongest, largest beneficiaries of the structure of the ERI, because my work has really deeply shifted into this more not just applied but integrative way or nature because of these collaborations I've been able to develop, and that is in many ways the heart of what I think about now.
So one of the things that I noticed in the Q&A, there was a question about the collaborations, and the question about whether Irene and I would have been collaborated without the ERI, without the Grand Challenge. And the answer to that is yes, but it has changed the nature of the collaboration that we have. And one of the things that we were fortunate earlier this year to be able to get is we were PIs on an NSF Rules of Life grant that got funded. Now, it's very molecular in nature, but part of that grant in the broader impacts is an adaptation of some of the project that we're currently working on with the ERI, and but it's bringing it into the classroom for undergraduates. And so, you know, when we start talking about how do you actually make change, and how do you get things to change, and how do you get people to engage with in a productive way with data and conclusions that would lead in a certain direction. Having younger people, college students, coming out with an understanding of what these things mean is, maybe I'm naive, but I'm hopeful that that's the way we get change to happen. So, our hope is that by bringing that type of thing into the classroom and by getting students to engage in a meaningful research experience with that work, that they get to see what science is, what it can lead to, and then, not all science students are going to end up being scientists. Some of them, I've had students who've gone on into policy, science policy. I was talking to one of my former students on the phone yesterday, who's doing a science policy master's at Georgetown, and these are the types of places that I think these projects can make a difference if we can engage people, and we can engage undergraduate students in that work as well as graduate students and beyond. So.
Can I just echo that for a second, because it's one thing I think that is the premise of the Grand Challenge, and that is this notion that it's not just a question of having knowledge, or if you will, of being right. You've got to be able to bring others along with you, and whether you do that through persuasive science, or you do it through involving them in the process, or you do it through other means, law, executive orders, whatever, that we're never going to see a response to environmental change if people don't feel empowered or encouraged or facilitated to do something. So it's interesting to hear you talk about that specific example. Anna, could we go back? You raised something right at the start. I may have just misheard you, but if I heard you correctly, I'd love you to follow up on it, about some connection with COVID in particular. And are environmental changes making us more susceptible to pandemics like COVID? And are we learning things out of this pandemic that might help us prepare for or avoid others?
So short answer, yes. The long answer is the effects of humans on the environment are increasingly causing zoonotic events, particularly in more vulnerable populations. So COVID, while we don't know exactly from what animal SARS-CoV-2 jumped from in order to start what we know now as the COVID-19 pandemic, we do know that is very close to other coronaviruses that have been described in bat species. And as you may remember, at the beginning of the epidemic, there was a whole host of potential candidates of wildlife from where SARS-CoV-2 could have happened. And we have a history, a long history of these jumps, right? We have measles, which we only think as a human disease, but in fact happened many centuries ago. It actually jumped from wildlife to humans. The same with Ebola, not so many years ago, still very fresh in our memory, and MERS, which is also a coronavirus, which jumped from other species onto humans, and of course SARS as well, SARS-CoV-1, the original, which also jumped. So we do have this history of this, again, that interface between humans and wildlife that causes opportunities for this to happen. Having said that, we do have zoonotic events every day, and most of them actually have bottlenecks such that it actually does not lead to an epidemic or even a pandemic. So it's not that we have to go crazy and think, oh my God, I cannot even get out of my house, otherwise there will be a zoonotic event. That is not the point. But the point is that climate change is a result of anthropogenic action. So deforestation, urban encroachment on wildlife, and increased rural exploitation, and I can list many more, which actually lead for that increased opportunity for viruses and bacteria and other pathogens that indeed actually live in equilibrium with their original hosts, their reservoirs, and if given the opportunity of jumping onto humans, can actually wreak havoc, as we all know now with COVID-19. Adding to that, globalization and the way that we are now connected to everywhere in the world creates new opportunities for a single jump from an animal to a human to actually become a massive problem.
I don't know if I feel uplifted or depressed by that,
So I think uplifted, right? Because one sentence on that, uplifted because a year after what has happened, we know a lot more. And I think that what we are now experiencing is this idea that public health is not just a one simple problem that needs to be addressed, but it's actually a complex system. And I apologize because I tend to use complex system quite a lot, but it is kind of a holistic problem, such that we need to invest in conservation. We need to invest in social programs like Ranjan and Jen mentioned, right? We need to understand what are policies that are binding, which is something I've learned with my economist friends. So it's this kind of like, in order for public health to be effective, there's kind of a chain of other basic science and other fields that actually allow us to create a program that actually is effective. So knowledge from what we know now of how humans cause damage, hopefully will allow us to mitigate some problems and even avert new opportunities for other pandemics that might occur.
Okay, great, thank you. So I've got loads more questions, but I feel like I should give the rest of the participants a chance. Jonathan, are there questions we should be taking now? Do you want to throw them in?
Yeah, we've got a few questions from the audience. One here, a couple panelists kind of mentioned collaborations that have been sparked by their interaction with researchers through ERI. Are there other examples of ways any of the panelists have engaged in interaction with one another as part of the Grand Challenge? And Rich, you mentioned your collaboration with Irene. Was that due to the Grand Challenge, or would you have been working together anyway?
Yeah, I think that's one where, I mean, we would have been working together anyway, but it really is the nature of the collaboration that has shifted a little bit into what the focus has become, or how we're thinking about the work that we would have been doing. One of the odd things about the Wolbachia aspect of stuff is that, you know, Wolbachia, and I was interested with what Anna was saying, you know, these are very complex systems, and a public health approach is fine from the point of view of a focus, but it's not the only thing that we should be thinking about. I mean, if we think about the idea of disease transmission and arthropod-based disease transmission, mosquito disease transmission, the US did a fantastic job of getting rid of yellow fever and malaria during the 20th century. We drained wetlands and we sprayed with DDT. Did a great job of getting rid of disease. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the approach that we want to be taking. So, you know, these things do become a lot more complicated. We're currently, globally, there's a global mosquito program, and they're releasing Wolbachia-infected Aedes aegypti to reduce dengue virus transmission predominantly. That's fine, it seems to work, but we've also got to understand we don't know what it is that Wolbachia is doing to the mosquito to prevent the virus from replicating, and we don't know if the virus can evolve around that and adapt. We're not fully confident of that because we don't know the mechanisms involved. So there's a lot of things to think about. Good public health approach, but we don't know what's beyond the initial impact of what we're doing. So.
And as far as collaboration, Ranjan, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Fellows program.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I'm one of the ERI fellows. There was a cohort initially of 12, and then we've lost a few to people going on to new positions, and we've gained a new fellow as well. And the idea was these are all early career scholars, but well-established, able to be independent scholars, but that they come from, broad, like across, just as broad as the ERI, from all across the university. There's humanists, there are natural scientists, like earth scientists, as well as biologists. There's the historian fellow, a law fellow, social scientists. Again, the idea is that it's this really wide-ranging group of people, and there was a certain amount of shove them all in a room for long enough, and something interesting will happen. And I think it did. I think, and I was sort of reflecting on this, and I honestly can't think of another example of a group or a program at a university that has quite as wide a group of people that you then also give them a lot of autonomy and freedom. If everybody has a whole bunch of other requirements on their time, then it's easy to get pulled back into whatever your lane is. But by giving us a lot of opportunity and freedom and autonomy, again, like I said, I had an opportunity to spend a bunch of time with social scientists and people who are not biologists that I just couldn't have imagined in a standard biology program, even one that tends to be a wide thinking biology program. But as I said, so I work with social scientists. There have also been, and I should say there's an artist in residence fellow. And so the historian fellow and the artist have worked together to develop a project that sort of incorporates sort of aspects of the history, and in fact, the history related to environment and change of Indiana, that the historian fellow was able to think about, to bring in that scholarship, but then display it in ways that, in her disciplinary strategy, like she would have written a book. But instead, she worked with an artist to create this installation that allows her to present that information in ways that she wouldn't have otherwise. I know there's been a lot of, there was interactions with the law fellow that again allowed the natural and social scientists to think about how to apply their knowledge and scholarship into ways that I think perhaps have more direct sort of policy and governance implications, because lawyers are the ones who help make laws. And I think that these opportunities, just like to both work together, but really just even to talk together, I have really wanted to be a part of, and I love being a part of the university because of the broad number and types of smart people that are around, but it's really easy to not talk to most of them most of the time. And the ERI was a pretty, and is a pretty amazing mechanism to break down some of those walls. Hands down, again, I'd say that's the most powerful part of it.
Can I just jump on there too? So Ranjan kind of talked about the fellows experience, but I think one of the great things about the fellows program is that it kind of bubbled up to affect the rest of us too. And so, the artist that Ranjan mentioned, Maria, she was in my lab taking photographs of our plates of microbes, to potentially use in a future art exhibit. And it was just so great, not just for me, but for my students to, to have that interaction with her and think about how she sees science and the questions she asked us about what we were doing. And another fellow, the social scientist, Matt Hauser, they organize these coffee and donut sessions at the ERI house. And in my mind, some of the best collaborations just come out of these informal conversations. And so, Matt and I, we've kind of embarked on this long, NSF funded grant now, but we're teaching a semester course together. And it's the outcome of bringing all these motivated young scientists who have so much energy and can kind of reinvigorate the rest of us into one place.
We have a question about modeling work at ERI. This person mentions access to various data from data sources, models, model coupling, model prediction, and comparison. Do any of our panelists have model systems or tools that they use or that they need for their work?
Okay, so I will take a first stab at that. Also to marry a little bit onto the previous question. So the tick-borne project that I briefly mentioned, that is actually a Midwest-based project and primarily in Indiana, was born out of ERI. I met Carol Modior, and I met Ben Kravitz, also a hired faculty, and we got to thinking about, wouldn't it be fun to have a huge project where actual data that is collected, not just historically, but presently, that would be, of course, Carol's field, and then a component of climate work, but a real coupled system where we actually have a proper climate model from Ben that would actually then feed into the kinds of mathematical models that I do by creating these coupled systems where we understand the true role of long-term effects of climate through this pathway of different players in the transmission process. That translates into a lot of data that is necessary. So by default, I'm more of a theoretical person, but because of that, I tend to have immense respect for collaborators that do create the data that I get to play with. But also the kind of work that I do sometimes makes it so that we can create a model that is more tractable, because we can fast forward 100 years or hindcast into the past, and then we do validate a lot of those parameters because of data. So the ERI program has allowed me to come in as junior faculty because I came from a postdoc program onto a tenure track position. So I was like brand new, bushy tail, bright eyes. And the ERI program allowed me to be more confident into approaching colleagues of other fields in that umbrella of ERI, saying, look, we are in the same program. We have same types of questions, but looked at through different lenses. And then we kind of naturally decide what parts can we most contribute to. So it has been very successful in that way. So with Ben, I actually have two projects. I have a Zika project that we're actually using. Our study system is Indonesia. And again, we're creating these huge coupled models where the environment actually feeds in to the transmission, not just as a covariate, but actual kind of interface between the two kind of dynamical systems. So data is of course paramount, but validation is the key to all of the work that I do, because I can create whatever model that I want. If I don't calibrate it well with data, then it's not meaningful, for sure.
John, other questions or?
We have a question about bringing in people from outside of the university into the research process. Do any of the panelists have research projects where they engage with members of the public or government entities, or just non-research members?
So I can very briefly say a sentence because I don't want to be boring. So a lot of the things that I do, as I mentioned, has that component of advisory and trying to understand how can my models inform future policies or present policies. So to that effect, I was very fortunate that I was asked to join a World Health Organization task force where I advise in creating models of school closures and try to understand the role of school closures and the role of infants and K through 12 on COVID transmission. So that has been incredibly a huge learning experience for me. So, and in the past, while I was still in the UK before I came to the US, because I was working on bovine tuberculosis, which is, again, a very interesting system because it has the cattle component, so human, rural component, and the wildlife component. So I actually had to testify in Parliament a lot of times, not always successfully, may I add, that, you know, about the culling of wildlife reservoirs and the effect of that on bovine tuberculosis. And of course, you know, other roles in state, Indiana State Health Department as well. So we're now involved as a group. So that's the key point as well. It's never just one person advising, it's always a group. And then I think the ERI is perfect in training us to really work in a group of people that have different vantage points, right? So we're kind of creating a program to inform key demographics and key populations in Indiana about the benefits of COVID-19 vaccination in this case. So yeah, this idea of having that engagement with stakeholders, if we want to use a jargon word, is actually important, but not always successful. And the key thing is that sometimes the lack of success is on us because we might not be very successfully creating a message that translates onto the real world. But sometimes it doesn't work because the system is not ready yet for our ideas to truly be incorporated. So whatever we do, it's a learning process for all partners in this type of work.
Great, thank you. Are there others on this point about collaborating outside of the university?
So the social scientist Matt Hauser and I, we're just starting this project, but I'm really excited. We're going to be interviewing 90 farmers across Indiana and then throughout the Midwest. And Matt's trying to understand how they make decisions in the face of climate change. And then the ecologists like me are studying their soils and the microbial communities inhabiting their soils. And then eventually we'll take all that data back to the farmers, right? And so the only people who probably love soil and the microbes that inhabit it more than me are the farmers themselves, right? And so, yeah, I mean, that's a project where, you know, like we couldn't do that without their participation. And I think, I mean, normally, yeah, farmers are really interested in hearing about their soil health and, you know, how what they do can affect the soil properties.
Along similar lines, we have a question about students specifically. Does ERI also encourage collaboration among students as well as researchers?
So I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question. Ranjan, do you have a better feel of what is the engagement with students?
Well, I will say, I think maybe it has been a certain challenge for the ERI, and I can certainly speak to the fellows that a number of us have engaged with some undergrad students, maybe as technicians, but because we are still fundamentally shorter term, you know, members of the university, I think that would be one thing that's been hard for us to engage too much. Although we've had sort of more informal opportunities. In fact, like I've worked with Jen and her lab group a lot, so I've had a lot of interaction with her grad students and a couple of the other grad students in the department. And so I think that there have been a number of these informal opportunities to interact, but speaking at least from the side of the fellows, it's tended to be more those informal rather than formal connections.
And I think a lot of it happens through collaborations. So for example, Sarah Mincy of the Integrated Program in the Environment is on the ERI steering committee. Next year's semester theme is resilience. And so the ERI is heavily involved in the planning for that as well. So I think a lot of our work with undergraduates happens through those collaborations. We also, is it the Sustainability Fellows? I hope I'm not getting the name wrong, but we basically embed undergraduates into local communities to come up with greenhouse gas inventories and things like that. So there are kind of targeted programs that involve undergraduates.
Let me just jump in on the question, which I think, frankly, is I am asked most frequently about environmental change, and that is, you can slice it any way you want, but what people basically want to know is either what can I do, or is there any hope? In other words, these are such big things we talk about, the climate, we talk about massive, ticks and mosquitoes and all of these invasive species. And what is there? So as people who work and build models and do field work and work deeply in these areas, do you see, I hate to say reason for hope, but that's frankly what people want to know. In other words, do you see that, we're swearing in a new administration in Washington tomorrow. ERI does a lot of work on the state level and with local governments. Are these types of initiatives backed by science able to make a difference, or are we just on a roller coaster and we've got to sit back and wait and see what happens next?
So one sentence for me. Yes, there's cause for hope, and yes, it's down to everyone. What COVID-19 has taught us is that these kinds of problems, so I'm talking from the context of infectious diseases, right? It's not a them problem, it's an us problem. So what I mean by this is that what I do affects people that I never get to meet, because I can start a chain of transmission events that will actually end up affecting people in another town, in another country that I will never see. So this idea that by removing myself and breaking a link of that chain, I'm somewhat contributing to averting future cases or even future deaths. So I think from the context of climate effects, it has been that problem, at least one of the bigger problems, which is, oh, if I take a plastic bag from the supermarket, it's just one plastic bag, it's not going to affect anyone, therefore I'm just going to do it, right? So I think that's the shift in mentality that perhaps we need to focus on, is this idea that, and physics has taught us this, like every action has a reaction. There are chain events, right? So is this idea that obviously we're always going to make a mistake and do something wrong, but changing our behaviors such that we're not thinking about just the present, but actually what will actually happen as chain events. And it sounds very Miss Universe. I know exactly what most of the people hearing me think, oh, it's just, world peace and so on. No, it's actually this idea of thinking a lot about what you're doing and how it affects people around you, but most importantly, how it's actually affecting people that you will never meet.
Okay, thank you. Ranjan, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, well, I certainly think that there are specific practical solutions to many of these questions that we're working on. I think there's some insights to disease and management, to invasions, but I think actually I'd like to make a slightly larger point, which is something powerful about the ERI to me, which, I think as scientists, we want to find solutions. It's like, that's our deal, right? Here's my topic. I'm going to fix the problem here. Like, I study this and I'm going to build a better mousetrap. I'm going to find the new energy source. But I think being at a place like the ERI, which has this broader, integrative, conceptual, interdisciplinary idea, it has really helped me, and I think helps many of us, to think outside the realm of our own specific lane and think about that we do need broader, systemic changes, that this isn't about just me turning off a light bulb, but about how do we come up with broader, societal structural changes? How do we have not just a specific policy that's going to increase energy efficiency by a little bit, but but this broader conception that we need to rebuild society, not to get too grandiose, but rebuild things around solving these grand challenges, and that we need to do that in not just our own specific small lane, which will always lead to small specific technological solutions, but rather, but that we need social, cultural, societal changes.
Okay, right. You're both helping me feel better. Rich, let me give you and Jen just a last word here, whether you want to talk on this subject or any other subject.
Okay. I almost don't want to talk about this subject. I don't know that I'm quite as optimistic as everybody else.
Okay,
So
that's fine.
it's not my, well, okay. So one of the issues that we tend to, we deal with in the context of infectious disease, and maybe the most obvious example, and this is different than what we're talking about at the moment, but say HIV transmission. We know that about 95% of new HIV cases are transmitted by only 5% of the HIV positive individuals. Most people who are HIV positive don't transmit it on. A very small percentage of people do. And this relates to something in economics, I think, called Pareto's principle, which in there it's called an 80-20 rule, right? I would suggest that we're going to see probably with something like COVID that we're dealing with a similar kind of thing, that most people are going to behave responsibly. Maybe a minority of people are going to behave less responsibly, but that's going to push an epidemic forward. I am unsure that if we do not manage to personally incentivize responsible behavior, right, that that enough people are necessarily going to change what they do. That's my fundamental question: is if it's not good for me, now, why would I do it? And I try not to behave that way myself, but I think a lot of people, whether they're conscious of it or not, do. And I think that's true unfortunately, with environmental factors as well. Why would I? Yeah, it's just one plastic bag. I'm just going to drive to the store instead of walk to the store. Everybody can make an exception, and that's what concerns me. And when you think about the idea that over the next couple of decades, we're probably going to have 2 billion more people on the planet than we do right now, the question to me is, how do you manage to sustain that given what we've got without increasing the impact and damage to the environment? Land use is going to be as critical in terms of things like infectious disease as climate change. So I hope that, I hope for change. I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know how we get people there. I would go back to the idea that we do need to be investing in interdisciplinary education with young people, from middle school onwards, that these things should not be just stuck in a biology class or a physics class or a chemistry class or a history class, that we need to get all those disciplines into the same classroom and have people thinking in a much more complex way about how we as human beings behave and how we interact with our environment. Because it is not, Ranjan and Anna talked about, it's not simple. It's a very complex thing, and it is not just science. So.
Great.
No, thank you. I appreciate the frankness, and frankly, you make the case for a grand challenge. In other words, it's not a question of sending scientists in a lab. It's a question of engaging in a way that will persuade the public and policymakers and business leaders and others. And so I want to give the last word here to Jen, who has been waiting patiently through this. Are you going to come out on the feeling optimistic, or are you worried?
I am an internal optimist.
Okay.
But I have anecdotal evidence in support of my optimism, right? So if we think back 30 years and everybody littered, right? But when I was a kid, I was taught not to litter, and nobody litters anymore, right? You're a pariah if you throw your trash out the window. And so I think these types of changes, like these individual level changes, can happen. It just takes time. And I think Rich is right that it takes reaching the younger generation and changing those perceptions. So it's a huge problem, right? And to to solve it, I think would requires like everything that the ERI is trying to do. So understanding the problem, looking for technological solutions, but also looking for the sociological solutions. And yeah, and Fred, I think, you know, you said it this way, right? Like it takes like this interdisciplinary perspective, and it also takes looking out, right? We can't just sit here in our offices at IU. It takes, you know, engaging with the rest of the population of Indiana.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists for both joining us today, but also for the work that you do as part of this grand challenge. We all benefit from that. Thanks very much to John Hines and to Anna Velasco, who helped to organize today. And once again, congratulations to our good friend and fearless leader, Janet McCabe, as you set off on a new and amazing grand challenge ahead, for which we're all deeply grateful. So thank you again. Have a good day.